assisting us in the facilitation of our annual meeting today. This is our first virtual annual meeting of the National Museum of Forest Service History. My name is Lisa Tate, and I am the Executive Director of the organization. I would like to welcome everyone to our meeting today. Thank you so much for coming. We're all so looking forward to hearing from our president, Tom Thompson, and from board member Shar Miller. So without further ado, I will turn this over to our president, Tom Thompson, for his State of the Museum address and board introductions.
Thanks, Lisa. As Lisa said, this is the first time we've ever done this. And this year there's been a lot of firsts, and some good and some bad, but it's really good to have all of you on the call today that are able to make it. For those of us that are associated with the museum organization in any way, as both volunteers and the staff, we really want you to know that we believe that this is perhaps one of the most exciting times and important times in the development of the museum. It's also great to be part of a great board. We have a unique and energetic group of folks who serve, try to guide and do the work on behalf of the museum. I'd like for each of those board members to introduce themselves very, very quickly. And I say very, very quickly because I know that we can go on, but and I'd like them to just introduce themselves and their connection to the Forest Service. And I thought the best way to do this would start off by states. And we'll start with Montana. So if you're from Montana, introduce yourself and introduce yourself and your connection to the Forest Service. Fred?
Okay, I'll start. Then this is Dale Bosworth.
Next.
Just a quick reminder that if you are not speaking, we need you to mute yourself. Thank you.
Rich Stem from Montana, a retired deputy regional forester. Other jobs as well. Last one, Region 2. Representing Region 1 as a board member.
Dave Stack, I'm the vice president and retired district ranger from Montana.
This is John Drake.
Well, anybody else from Montana? State of Washington. Oh, Ano.
How about me, Tom?
You got it.
Hell, I was a GS4 artillery gunner once for a few years. And beyond that, I ran a ski area that operated on a Forest Service special use permit for 40 years and ran a commercial rafting company in Montana, was on a special use permit for 40 years as well. And happy and proud to be here.
Thanks, Ano. Any other from Montana? State of Washington.
Hi, Phil Awney. I was a program manager with the Pacific Southwest Research Station in Albany, California, and been a board member for about 4 or 5 years now.
Oregon.
Dick Woodfin, 5 years at the Rapid City at the Rocky Mountain Station, 3 years Forest Products Lab, the rest of the time PNW Station, Portland, retired deputy director. Resident cowboy.
Liz?
Liz Agpawa, retired out of the Atlanta Regional Office 6 years ago.
California.
Good afternoon. This is Nancy Gibson. I'm in Lake Tahoe, California, South Lake Tahoe, retired as a forest supervisor here. Spent time also in Montana and Oregon, and glad to be on this first ever annual event. Thank you.
And Char is with us, and we'll introduce him in a bit. He's on the board as well. Idaho, Lynn.
Lynn Sprague, retired as regional forester in California, and been on the board since 1999.
Arizona, Andy.
Yeah, Andy Mason retired about 6 years ago, 35 years in the Forest Service all over the country. I'm the secretary for the museum and chair of the Operations Funding Committee. Thanks.
And Colorado, we have Michelle Pearson, but I don't think Michelle's on, and myself. Wyoming, is Pat on?
Yes. Yeah, Pat Lynch. I had half a career in the Forest Service, working as a district ranger in Colorado and Wyoming, and also worked in the regional office in Juneau, Alaska. I also worked in Region 6, and after my stint with the Forest Service, started a company, Western Heritage Company, which my son now has, and makes merchandise for the Forest Service and all the other federal land management agencies.
Okay, moving east, Ohio.
Hi, this is Barb Tormelin. I'm one of the newer board members. Having retired 6 years ago, spent half my 37-year career with Region 9 and the other half with Northeastern Area State and Private Forestry, and retired as the field representative in St. Paul, Minnesota. Glad to be part of this group. Thank you.
And South Carolina. Charlie.
I guess that's me. I'm in Greenville, South Carolina. Retired in 2014 out of the Washington office as the director of rangeland management and vegetation ecology. Spent most of my career in Region 2, and I've been on the board for 2 years.
Very good. And we have Washington, D.C. represented by John.
John Stevenson, spent 15 years mostly in Region 6. Now work for Esri, still with the Forest Service, but as a private sector person.
And we have John McLean also that lives in Washington, D.C. I don't think John's on. Did I miss any board members? Very good. We have a couple past board members on the call, Jim LeBou, Steve Anderson, and Ted Stubblefield. And we also have a number of folks who are on the regional director group. Well, I appreciate that. And as I said, this is really a special time for us, I think, as a museum. We're closer than we've ever been in realizing our goal of being able to construct our cornerstone Conservation Legacy Center in Missoula. We also want you to know that what we're doing is for you, our members today, and for those who follow in the years ahead. What we're trying to do is ensure that the stories and certainly the rich history of the Forest Service isn't lost, but it's remembered and used with pride and respect for the public lands and resources that we have in this country. Just a couple updates on some things for the museum, and then we'll move on to our keynote, but we'll talk a little bit about our capital campaign. As with all of America, this year has certainly brought some unique and difficult challenges. We've been impacted like everyone else, but we've continued on, and we're moved ahead in many significant ways as the year has gone along. This year has brought some amazing accomplishments and developments. We received several substantial gifts this year, which have inspired all of us to refresh our optimism and our energy in doing what we can to finish off our capital campaign. We're grateful for Bill Cannon's gift, for George Gibbs, for the Southern Foundation, and several others who've shown their generous support and confidence in what we're doing as a museum. In the last year, we received over $3 million in additional support to our campaign. We still have work to do, but we have some promising opportunities, and I hope that to be in a position where we can finish off our capital campaign very, very soon. Our building, as we've come closer to being able to begin construction, we've taken a hard look at our building design, and we've chosen to incorporate some new developments in mass timber construction in our design. The Forest Service for years has been a leader in forest products innovation and development through sustained research and support. And mass timber is one of those areas of development. We believe that the museum really should be a showcase to illustrate how important that work has been, and also how important sustainable forest resources are to the future of our country. We're working hard to ensure that we do this in a way that benefits the museum efforts, but also helps tell the story of the wise use of resources. That's the foundation of the Forest Service story. We're excited to be at a point where we can begin to finalize our development of the Conservation Legacy Center. Just a word about our collection. We continue to do all we can to protect and manage and use our historic collection. Totals over 50,000 items. Board member and museum curator David Stack, who's on the call, donates an extraordinary amount of time cataloging and managing and ensuring that the collection is properly taken care of. He is a quiet hero, and his contributions over the years have been key in building the strong foundation of support that we have in so many areas. A word about membership. We've worked hard this past year to increase the support we have with increased and more engaged membership. We have about 900 members now and hope to pass the 1,000-year mark by the end of the year. And then we're going to embark on trying to reach out towards 2,000. We've offered a special membership rate this year of $20.20 per year for this year, 2020. And it's indeed our members who provide the incentive for the work we do. We endeavor to keep members engaged and informed throughout the year with our newsletters and other efforts, including Facebook and constant contact. I want to thank each of you who are members for your support, and encourage you to share your ideas and thoughts with us throughout the year. I hope that you will also look for ways that you can help reach out to new members and perhaps even sponsor a new member in 2021. We've taken on several special initiatives in 2020. The past year, we've undertaken an effort to reach out to people in the organization and increase the understanding and hopefully increase their support for the use of their museum. Our Ranger Roll Call has been an effort to compile a listing of all Rangers on all units of the agency since the beginnings over 100 years ago. We've asked for help from each Ranger who currently serves at the district level to help us compile that listing using existing records that are found in most district offices. We continue to work on this effort, and we recognize that it's been an extremely difficult year for folks in the agency due to both coronavirus and also the unprecedented impacts of fire that have been throughout the country. We're working to conduct a special auction since we've not been able to conduct some of our traditional Evening with Teddy events due to the COVID crisis. We're in the process of securing items for the auction that we're going to conduct in the spring of this coming year. Throughout the year, much of the work that gets done is done by volunteers. So many hours are donated to help with the visitor center on the campus, to do maintenance, to work on special projects, to take care of our collection, to serve as regional directors on the board, various committees. We're essentially a volunteer organization, and our strength comes from each and every one of you who helps throughout the year. And we want to thank you for your support and your help and your involvement. Again, I want to thank members of our board that are on the call and those that are not. We have an increasingly diverse board and are proud of their commitment and the dedication to ensuring the decisions and work of the museums in keeping with the mission and in accordance with our bylaws. We meet every 2 months and typically have one in-person meeting each year. Over the past year, board members have been instrumental in reaching out to a number of potential supporters and contributors. Special recognition goes to Charlie Richmond, who has worked very closely with the Public Lands Council and worked to reach a broad cross-section of the ranching community to gain their support for the museum. Similarly, Rich Stem has worked hard in connecting with the forest products industry. Many of our board members are engaged in multiple committees and devote considerable time to what we're trying to accomplish. This year, we've worked hard to expand and invigorate our cadre of regional directors. Thanks to Larry Gatt, Andy Mason, Lynn Sprague, and others for their extra effort in working to strengthen this important group of committed museum supporters. Now we have a really solid core of folks in each part of the country, comprised mostly of retirees from all aspects of the agency, including state and private forestry and research. The group, I think, is hugely important to ensuring that we stay connected with our members and continually reach out to new folks and potential members. Several of those folks are on the call today, and I want to thank you all for your involvement with the Regional Director Group. Lastly, I want to thank our Executive Director, Lisa Tate, and our Development Director, Tom Peterson, for their dedication and their continuous work on behalf of the museum. We have a very lean staff, but they work continuously throughout the year to ensure that we're headed in the right direction. They try to keep us on track, and they try to give us polite suggestions as to how we can improve what we're doing as a board. I think we're doing everything we can to further the work and the mission of the organization, and much of that success goes back to Lisa and to Tom Peterson. In closing, I just want to say how proud I am of the work and the people that we have involved with the museum, and I want to thank you all. If any of you have questions, you can use the chat thing to offer those, and we will either respond to them towards the end or respond to you on the chat box. So with that, I think it's time probably to turn it over to our special keynote speaker today. And I know many of you already know Char Miller, and I'm sure that a number of you are on the call today because you're looking forward to Char's talk. Char is the W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis and History at Pomona College in Claremont, California. He's written numerous books. I have a bookcase over there with almost all of them, I think, but a few recent ones. He's written about Roosevelt and Hetch Hetchy recently, and Ogallala, America's Great National Forests and Wildernesses and Grasslands. He's an award-winning teacher and writer, senior fellow at the Pinchot Institute, fellow at the Forest History Society, and he's been a member of our board now for a couple of years. I've known Char probably close to 25 years now, and know that he's such a great historian and also a great supporter of the Forest Service and its wonderful history. So with that, Char, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Tom, so much. And thank you to everybody who is on the call. I was whipping through the participants' names to see who was there. I do see old friends, which is really, really fun. And also folks I haven't met. So I look forward to the point at which we actually can gather again. But three real key thank yous at the beginning. Lisa, Tom, and Dave Stack in particular, to the first two for the invitation to do this, which is really thrilling. And to Dave, who seemed to have read my mind when I said, well, I want some stuff out of the archives. And all of a sudden stuff material started flowing in. And given the shortness of the talk, I couldn't use all of it, but I'm thrilled to know that there were, like minds sort of were pulling away on this process. And so part of what I want to talk about, as the title suggests, and it's light play with the Forest Service's motto, is to suggest the way in which an archive like this, or the Forest History Society, and I know Steve Anderson is on here, so I want to give him a shout out as well, what archives do and what repositories are for, is in part for the holding of materials, whether it's tools, documents, photographs, you name it. It's important just to have the objects. So that's sort of step one, is to have those objects. But the real key, and the museum has been doing a really good job of doing this as best one can in this COVID world, is to make those materials available. Not just so that they can be digitized and sort of found by someone who's looking, but most of all, and it's the part that I've spent a large time of my life working through, is to handle them, to see them, to read them, to look at them, and then ultimately to interpret them. What do these things mean? What is a set of letters from Bob Marshall, which are in the archives? What does he say, but also how can we read those documents now 70, 80, 90 years later? And so part of that interpretive process is also to make the past present, to bring it into our time, in part because none of us interpret things in a vacuum. We're not in the past at that point. We are actually in the present, if those two things can be so separated. And I would argue, and I work with my students on this all the time, as we work with documents of one form or another, is to recognize that when we start to read something in the past, we actually are there, if only emotionally, if only temporarily. And we can bring these things back to life through our discussions of them, and recognize in that process that the past speaks to the present in the same way the present, which will soon be the past, speaks to the future. And so to think about past, present, and future as different countries, in effect, doesn't really work. They actually are integrated in crucial ways, and we're the integrators. We're the ones that make this possible as we work our way through this. And I love what Tom said about the plans for the new building. And again, the Forest Service has done this, the Forest History Society has done the same thing. Make the building speak by the materials that are embedded in it, by the objects that are archived there. Have the building become this part of the educational function. And that includes the landscape around it. Make that too sustainable and resilient as a subtle way by which to convey to visitors why this stuff matters. And so as much as I love going into archives and their sort of dustiness, I'm also eager to see the repositories themselves as physical objects convey the exact same expression. And as Tom said, let's use the latest of materials as a way to convey something about what it is this museum represents and what the Forest Service represents. So part of that representation is thinking about what's there. And so in conversation with Lisa and Dave Stack, we pulled some photographs as a way to sort of help us understand some of what's been going on. And I'm trying to figure out how to move this. Oh, there we go. Is to sort of look at objects that are there and begin this interpretive process, not only to see what's here, but also begin to ask why. So the first two slides are from the 1890s, before the Forest Service is formed. The Division of Forestry exists, but has no land whatsoever. Pinchot is not yet on the scene. He's going to be here in another 3 years in 1898. But these are images of trespass cuts by Anaconda on what would be called ultimately national forests. And it's in and of itself, you get to see how much wood they're taking out for their own needs. But it also tells us something about what the photographer and why the photographer is taking these images. You can find hundreds like this in the National Archives. We have some in the museum, but there's way more in the National Archives, because pre-Pinchot, and most especially Pinchot, recognize that photographs can convey arguments without any words whatsoever. And Pinchot's genius about that sort of strikes me as amazing. But that these images also teach lessons, not only about how one was harvested, but how rapidly it was, also comes through in this photograph. Same landscape, totally cleared. And for all of you, I don't need to tell you what we were looking at, but recognize that the heavy logging produced the erosion and made it even more difficult for this land necessarily to recover. And again, as I said, there are thousands of photographs like this in the National Archives. And what these things convey, like this one does from the anti-cognitive logging, is embedded in this is an argument about why this is unacceptable. Not that logs went into the marketplace. That's not the issue. The issue is, what's the physical consequence? What's the environmental downstream consequence? And quite literally downstream, right? The carving of erosion suggests the dilemmas that would be faced by subsequent generations. So here we are in a present, let's call it 1895. But we're looking at this 120 years later and recognizing that it also suggests to us that in between then and now, it would have been really nice, and in fact happened, if someone could get in there and remanage that, regenerate that landscape. And so we're in a conversation with this past immediately, precisely because it speaks so directly to what the National Forest Museum, the Forest Service Museum works on, thinks about, and archives. And hence the archive is a way to spark conversations about past management, but also this is the last thing we want to have happen now, right? So the past can also guide us as to what stewardship could be, should be in the 21st century. So the other thing that, it does is not only sort of open up a conversation about, well, we can't be doing that. So what is it that we should be doing? And here again, the agency, the Forest Service, becomes one way by which to analyze this. And I love this photograph of the fire science research team out of Missoula. You'll figure out who some of these folks are. Bob Marshall on the back right-hand side, Ehlers Koch on the foreground, who was in Missoula for his 40-year career, and a remarkable figure. And if you haven't read his book, 40 Years a Forester, I was able to bring out a second annotated edition last year through the University of Nebraska Press. I mean, he's a remarkable figure inside the agency, filled with remarkable figures, as this photograph attests. So Gisborne, one of the great fire scientists back in the day, they're here as a collection. You go, okay, interesting photograph. But then you start to think, wait a second, demographics, who they are, how they got there, what role, for example, the Yale Forest School played in assembling people like this. Koch went there and others in this photograph did as well. But also they're interrogating in 1927, and actually much earlier than this, we just have this particular photograph. They're interrogating the role of fire in Forest Service management. What's it going to be like? How are we going to fight fire more effectively, more efficiently? Koch will, by the 1930s, come to a decision that fighting all fires was a mistake, and wrote a brilliant essay for the Journal of Forestry called The Passing of the Lolo Trail, which is in part about the passing of time and history, but also especially he begins to pull back from full-on suppression and suggest there are some lands that ought to burn. It's just not worth fighting them, and we'll get ecological benefits as a consequence of that. And so part of what it is that you can look at each of these individuals. Bob Marshall, one of the great Forest Service scientists, ultimately would found the Wilderness Society and underwrite it with his own donation at the end of his life to preserve the idea of wilderness as a concept that would ultimately emerge as the Wilderness Act. Each of these individuals has their own biographical story, their own contribution to the Forest Service. And so what looks like a flat 2D object, you can bring to life. And so even if you flip through these archival things, all of a sudden there's texture here. There's a conversation past and present. So Koch, who worked for the agency for 40 years, helps you understand that. And his book is beautiful in that regard. But each of them has that role to play. And so we can start this conversation and recognize that in 2020, for example, thinking about Koch and Marshall and Gisborne and others as they struggled to figure out how to deal with fire, that issue has not gone away. That issue is with us still. And we're using some of the exact same language that they were playing with to try to figure out how this agency is going to manage all of the millions of acres it manages that were fire prone. What are we going to do? Well, that's partly why they're sitting there. I mean, they're sitting there for a formal photograph, but break them behind the camera, and all of a sudden the conversations, I imagine, were incredibly rich, absolutely fascinating, and to the point to such an extent that I think they're talking to us, which is not a woo-woo thing. I actually think they're talking to us, and it would pay us, it would be wise of us to go back and look at what they talked about, in part because we get a sense for the context in which decisions they made still ramify in our own time. So to these places. This is one of many CCC camps, civilian conservation camps, constructed on national forests all over the country. And whether you're in the eastern or southern region or all of the western regions, including Alaska, the CCC was a crucial engagement for the Forest Service. And I really like the way the sort of rippedness here is as if we've really got a document here. So forgive my sort of graphic joy at this one. But so what does it mean to have a CCC? Those buildings, fabulous. We can do the archaeological work and find them. We can unearth at least a part of them. We can't necessarily take it into the archive, but the archive has all of these images from all over the place. And that opens up a conversation about, well, wait a second, where did that money come from? What was Roosevelt intending with this? What's the link to the Forest Service? Well, it turns out it's multiple. Gifford Pinchot, as governor of Pennsylvania, at the same time Roosevelt was governor of New York, preceded the CCC in what's called now retrospectively the Little New Deal. But the Little New Deal in Pennsylvania was actually the key to understanding Roosevelt's decision, because Roosevelt said, give me a white paper on what you're doing, because he was doing the exact same thing in 1932 in Pennsylvania. He called up Raphael Zahn and Bob Marshall, who came up to his house, Gray Towers, for a weekend. They drafted this extraordinary document that they sent to Roosevelt, which, by the way, included CCC, but also they said, buy up all of the private timberland in the United States. They thought it would cost $1 billion, which would have been really cheap by today's dollars. But those buildings actually have their antecedents in 3 Forest Service folks thinking out broadly about what we could do with the forest, national and private, and how we could at the same time regenerate human beings, not just the land, but the human beings who would work on it. Hence, these camps run with military precision, as they look here, are also going to be rebuilding the bodies of the men who work here. And again, we've got letters in the museum. We have documents that help us see this. Bodies that will, in short order, go into the US Army to fight World War II. There's a direct line between that recovery process that was physical, human physical, and landscape that would then lead in this direction. And the other thing, if you think about what these guys are doing, what they're building, among other things, roads, trails, cabins. My wife and I, when we go camping, try to stay in as many of those cabins as we can at state and national forests, in part because, like, who wouldn't? These things are so beautifully built. What that means is that the CCC is also building the recreational economy to come. They're building wharves, they're building docks, they're building boat ramps, they're building trails, they're building all the facilities on national parks, Forest Service, refuges, and the like. that would, after the war, become the thing that attract people to the national forests, the national parks, and the national wildlife refuges. So they're laying the groundwork by this very bulldozer plowing through what I assume is Southern California, because it certainly looks like the landscape I get to walk through every morning. And so we will say, well, that's great. That's really great. Until you read Aldo Leopold's, another Forest Service folk person, who was not entirely convinced that what the CCC was doing was the best of things all of the time. Ehlers Koch felt the same way, by the way. To build a road, says Leopold, is so much simpler than to think what the country really needs, which is the ecologist critiquing the notion of this, of trucks and bulldozers and trail crews. And it's a perfectly appropriate position for Leopold to have taken and makes sense, I think. And it also suggests that there are other ways that we also need to think about the CCC. These are African-American Corps members who worked in segregated sites. And that too tells us something that is deeply there present, but not that distant from our present. That to understand the racial prejudices that produce that, and thus the segregated US Army, is to understand much of the way in which federal dollars could flow to reclaim land and people, but only in certain ways and with only certain kinds of social barriers that divided one group from another. So as progressive as the CCC was, it was not, in fact, all that progressive in terms of the social dynamics of the 1930s or 40s for that matter, and much beyond. So the other thing I was interested in, given the museum's siting in Missoula, was to recall that it's in Missoula, again, one of the great post-war debates that erupted in the United States, erupted around the Bitterroot National Forest and this photograph of the, oh my God, clear cut. Oh my God, presumably because you came around a corner and saw these hills terraced and denuded and went, oh my God. It's an intriguing set of photographs, and part of why I love this one in particular is the agency representative with the documents with all of this spread out before, and one could read internal to the agency, and again, there's materials inside the museum about this, how it was justified, because it's technically sweet. They actually did what they said they were going to do. And they can do it because now post-war bulldozers, other ways of getting in here to create these dynamics enabled the agency to say, look, if we can do it, why should we not try it? A whole science would erupt around this that would challenge those sets of decisions. But for this gentleman on the right-hand corner, it was a set of decisions that made sense in another context. The goal of the agency post-World War II was to get out the cut, move as much timber into market as possible for two reasons, one of which is to help the flow of lumber into the construction of suburban subdivisions that looped around New York City, looped around Los Angeles, Denver, you name your major metropolitan area, and a lot of small ones. And a lot of it will find that the timber ultimately came from the national forests. It came from national forests because private timber was tapped out by World War II. So we had this other repository of timber. But what it's really doing is dropping the price of lumber, which means you could build Levittown outside of New York City incredibly cheaply. And you could begin to house suburbanites who were fleeing New York or Denver or LA or wherever, and do it in a way that didn't destroy their bank account and also was subsidized by the GI Bill and cheap mortgages coming from the Federal Housing Authority. So the agency is part of this huge dynamic this clear cut helps us understand, of a fundamental transformation in the human geography in the United States that's continued ever since. to move out to the periphery, which is ever expanding, is part of what we think of as modern American urban systems. But it didn't come without a fight. And so I've got this quote from Lee Metcalf coming out of the Congressional Record that is also talking about this exact same clear cut. As he says, he started receiving letters sometime in the 1960s, late 1960s, pictures, angry words, newspaper articles describing logging practices which appeared to disregard every value of forest use except that of the cheapest removal of logs. A devastating critique that would be ramified by Gifford Bryce Pinchot, Gifford Pinchot's only child, who went up onto the clear top, up on these ridge lines, and decried what the agency had done. So where we have a picture of a Forest Service officer looking out over this in a benign way, Gifford Bryce Pinchot went up there and was deeply worried about what this said about the organization. And as you well know, because all of you who worked in the agency for as long as you have know that this was a flashpoint that defined a lot of your careers. Because the aftershock of this was twofold. One of which is the federal court said the agency could no longer do clear cutting until it figured out a multiple use plan, which would come. The National Forest Management Act will be one result, but so is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And that policy act, among many things, was designed to slow this down because it required public comment. Keep in mind, as much as current Forest Service folks, and I talk with a lot of them through the Middle Leadership Program, I mean, they spend most of their life working on NEPA projects. And I help them understand why that is by using these kinds of discussions. But it wasn't just aimed at the Forest Service. Every urban center that wanted a freeway to blast through neighborhoods found all of a sudden public comment based on NEPA required them to have public hearings. And believe me, urban planners, any more than Forest Service planners or Park Service planners, that's one of the last things they were really eager to do, which is to have the public start talking back at them, because it meant democracy was a reciprocal game, and reciprocity isn't always valued in that regard. So a single photograph can convey huge amounts of information fairly quickly. That helps us situate this photograph in a much larger and longer context over time. And finally, because I'm in Southern California and we've had some beautiful fires over the last decade or so, I sort of asked Dave, I mean, find me something about fires. And without saying Southern California, knowing where I was, I suspect he went, okay, I'm going to give him some fires. And so this is on the Cleveland National Forest, 1970s fire. But he also sent the document to the right. And I really appreciate that because this is a 1988 symposium. It's probably not the first such workshop, and it has certainly not been the last, that are in conversation with one another. Even though we don't see housing, one of the things that every single television network has become really good at is taking photographs or film of subdivisions punched deep into fire zones that then burn up. And it is so dramatic, more dramatic, I'll be honest, than the photograph on the left. Because to have seen this in fire is to go, okay, Chaparral is burning. That's what Chaparral does. It'll recover in one way or another. But what the workshop document from September of 1988 also tells us that 40 years ago, they're getting worried, 30 years ago, they're getting very worried about not the forest burning, but the pattern of build and burn subdivisions that are moving up into the forests. The latest data is something like 34 million new households since the mid-1990s have been constructed in the fire zones. Even if there's only one person in each of those houses, which we know isn't true, that's 34 million people. Add 3 people in there and we're close to a quarter of the nation's population. in the West alone. That's the dilemma that these photographs and documents help point to. And what I love about sort of working through these images and the many other that Dave shared and those that I've seen when I've been up in Missoula and going to the Forest History Society and others is the way in which we can actually see our present as the future of some earlier time, and they're talking to us. They know what's coming. And whether they explicitly state it, maybe it's just our projection, and certainly I enjoy projecting in these ways. But when we start building fireburbs, we could call them, in the midst of these places that are frankly beautiful. Of course you want to be on a ridgetop. Why wouldn't you? But if it's Malibu, not a really good idea. And this isn't about the agencies stopping it. It's actually about the counties and cities that greenlight developments in this way. But then we can have these kinds of conversations that date back at almost 40 years and perhaps longer than that in many respects. And that's a way in which the past and the present, as let alone the future, are in fact in conversation. And admittedly, it's we who make those ties manifest, that give them voice. But that can't happen if you don't have a National Museum of Forest Service history. It can't happen if you don't have repositories that hold on to these documents that are not just documents or tools, but they actually are containers of that past that are waiting for us to open those containers, read them, think about what they mean, and then begin to have a conversation publicly, which is what also this museum is about. It's not just about an historian walking in and going, oh yeah, this is really cool stuff. It's about people who don't know what they're about to encounter, look at it and learn why it's really cool and why it speaks to them in the ways that I think it perhaps should. So whether you're a picture of Bob Marshall or you're a picture of Chaparral burning or you've got an anaconda clear cut, each of these are ways, access points into a past that is vibrant, has not disappeared, and is actually part of the mission of the museum to bring it back into the present and thus back into the conversation, the cultural conversation about why we live on the land and how we might do so better. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, Shar. That was absolutely fabulous. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat and we can get your questions to Shar or to Tom, or if you have any questions for me, just let us know. I'm seeing a lot of really great positive comments about the presentation. Thank you, Shar, again.
Did I convince everybody? I mean, come on.
Well, we do have, while we're waiting for people to put any comments that they have in, we do have a prize drawing that we're doing for the participants of today's call. Our board member, John McLean, who couldn't be with us today, has donated a first edition, first printing and autographed copy of his book, Fire on the Mountain. So Bev from the Arizona Community Tree Council is going to be randomly generating a name from the list of participants. And so drum roll, please.
Okay, and the name coming up is Don Hanson.
Don Hanson?
So Don Hanson, I can see is on the call, but just unmute and
All right, well, congratulations. And we will get that to you in short order, Don. Any other questions from anyone? I'm again looking at the chat. A lot of really good comments. Yes, it is a stellar book that John donated. All right, well, any other, go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, sure. Where was that picture of that really ugly clear cut? That first picture that you showed, do you know where that is? Where the location is?
I don't, but Dave might. So I'm going to toss it to Dave because that's what good teachers do when they don't know stuff. They ask people who actually know it. Dave, do you know where that was? That anaconda from 1895?
I think we can dig that out of the records on that. I think it's, well, I won't hazard a guess right now, but definitely on the Bitterroot National Forest. And it's pretty well documented where that is. I don't know who gave the name. I think Orville Daniels likes to claim credit for that, but who knows?
Well, you just said anaconda, and I used to work over in that area.
Oh, Rich, you put yourself on mute there, Rich.
The reason I was asking was because I used to work over there near the town of Anaconda, and they had stripped that area amazingly, and that looked like that. I was just curious. That's a fascinating picture.
Yeah, it is.
Are you asking about the anaconda photos? Those are, we've got quite a number of those, including large flumes and railroad loading. And plus we've got a lot of court documents that kind of tie us in. So we know geographically where those major logging operations were.
There's a question from Dan O'Toole about NEPA over the past 50 years. Dan, I have a whole nother talk if you want to wait around, because I did this for Region 5 not too long ago. But you know, NEPA has had, the most startling thing about NEPA was that within days of its announcement in January 1970, that's when BLM put forward the first environmental impact statement around the Trans-Alaska Highway. It got stalled by lawsuits. It was 8 pages, like this very quick snapshot. Within 3 years, it was 3 volumes. Hundreds of thousands of documents were included in that. And it helps us understand how rapidly we went from we must have public comment to this excruciating detail. And James Skillen, an historian who's got a book about NEPA, one of his arguments is it's such a static document that it has not been able to flex as the demands on it has shifted over the years. And it's an interesting argument, a quite interesting argument. And I'm trying to think if I could probably send, there's a chapter of it that I can send that I think is really quite useful if anybody is interested. So, you know, we could do that. But its evolution has obviously been problematic for lots of land management agencies, state, local, and federal. But it has also forced us to reckon with what happened in the preceding decades, which was no public comment, rapid utilization, whether it's, again, urban areas or rural areas, doesn't matter because that happened in both places. And it does, I think, help us see why it has not evolved, in part because then you have stakeholders who are deeply attached to it. And also because maybe we haven't quite learned our lessons yet about why real public comment is an essential piece to this. And so, but it's an interesting article. And I'd be glad to share.
Char, this is Tom. You've given a lot of presentations to employees over the years about history. And have you noticed any increase or I guess raised level of interest among employees in the history of the agency and the importance of that to them in today's world. It seems like there's always interest in history, but people, I don't think in the agency necessarily look at it as a great resource for decision making every day. They like it. It's great to read, and then you go about doing your business. Any thoughts on that?
Well, you must have heard my talk, because that's actually one of the things I say to folks in the Middle Leadership Program almost every single session, which is that even if you don't pay attention to history, you're actually living it. You're embedded in it. And the decisions that you're making are based upon decisions that folks in this call made 20, 30 years ago, and are still shaping how and why you approach the issues that you approach. And so some of it is being self-conscious about that. But you're right, Tom, because I think partly what you're saying is the day job overwhelms the capacity intellectually to engage with that past, because you've got some stuff you got to get out the door, and understandably so. And I would say the same for anyone. I don't think it's just the agency. I would say that for an urban planner who is working in a small town like where I live in Claremont, California, or one in LA, they don't have a lot of time to go, oh yeah, so here's the history of planning in this small place. And I'm embedded within that history. And maybe I should be thinking about the differences between what I would like to have happen and what happened in the past. We don't have that kind of time, mostly. And maybe it's only historians who get to play around with this stuff. But I do think it's important to talk about, much as it was important today, is to help us understand the ways in which that past speaks directly to us, whether we're listening or not, it's there. And it's guiding us whether we know it or not. And I think it's Eddie Brannon, when he was head of the Gray Towers National Historical Site, would sort of welcome people to Gray Towers and said, look, the past is really sticky. It's right here. And it's not just this building, Gifford Pinchot's old home, but it is really sticky. And part of the job is to help see the stickiness, see the veil that seems to hide that cultural world, but it's there. So with NEPA or anything else, I think if you have some basic understanding of how these documents operate, then you can see yourself within it and also help to morph it in some fashion.
Thank you.
Sure. And Rachel Klein has a good point in response to your question, Tom, that more and more folks have been reaching out to the history unit in Enterprise to use historical context, oral histories, ethno studies, and the like to inform their management, which is really hopeful.
Well, thank you again, Shar, Tom,
Thank you guys so
everyone.
much.
All of our members and supporters of the museum. We really appreciate all that you do, and all of our members for all of your support. We're always here. If you have additional questions, just let us know. And we have recorded this session, so we will be making that available through our YouTube channel here in the next week or so.
Fantastic.
So thank you again, everyone. Unless there's anything else, we'll go ahead and adjourn. All right. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Nice to see all your faces.